As everyone, I don't need to introduce Julie, everyone knows her well and understands what a great column and pillar of the institution she's been. And I think that you're going to see a different side of Julie today, which is the intellectual side, and see how it is that she contributes to the field from that point of view. And very interesting ideas about terrorism, media, and conflict that will help to establish something in the subfield. So, Julie, take it away.
Thanks. This is exciting. Before I start, I wanted to just acknowledge a few people. So I'm not sure everybody knows. My dad is here, Joe Rouge. My daughter, Mackenzie. My mom, Beverly Rouge. Tyler. My brother, Carl. My husband, Randy. Thank you to the staff for getting this room functional. There was quite a flurry yesterday as people were trying to calibrate the smart boards and make all of this technology work. So I guess I get to be the guinea pig appropriately to see if we've actually solved some of those issues. So the topic that I was really interested in was thinking about terrorism and how we cover it in the media, and more recently been thinking a little bit about mass violence events and what the relationship is between media and mass violence events. Particularly looking at things like the Boston Marathon bombing and other kinds of things. But this research really came from an interest in how just inundated we are with images of terrorism and the stories about terrorism and the way they're told. They're perfect for media. They're sensational. They usually have violence. They usually have some kind of human face you can attach to it. And we're seeing them all over the place and in media all over the world. Terribly sorry. So I got interested about 7 or 8 years ago, particularly in female terrorists and why female terrorists were doing what they do, what made them tick, and particularly after the Beslan school bombing, where there was women and small children, involved in suicide bombings of small children, and I really didn't understand. So I really started looking into female terrorists. Why do they do what they do? And discovered that for the most part, they're a lot like male terrorists. They're really not. They have many of the same reasons, many of the same purposes, many of the same goals. So that individually they're a lot like male terrorists, but organizationally using female terrorists implies something really different. And one of the things that I found was that a lot of that difference had to do with media coverage. That women, when they're violent, are covered very differently by media outlets of all kinds, and that has an implication for particularly terrorism. Terrorism is a form of communication, and you can change how this communication is happening by using a different actor. That seemed to me to be a pretty important thing to know. So some of the research that I've done previously showed that when women commit violence, particularly terrorism, they get about double as much media coverage, and they get much more media coverage that actually focuses on the grievances of the group. What is the group about? What are they trying to accomplish? And so what I started thinking about was are there other kinds of things that terrorist groups can do to get different kinds of media coverage? And having lots of conversations with people where I said, well, do you think terrorist groups manipulate the media? And everybody seemed to think that was pretty common sense, yes, that they do manipulate the media. But I found that nobody really demonstrated that they could, in fact, manipulate the media. So one of the things that I think was important going into this was thinking about the labeling. There's multiple definitions of terrorism, and they are very political definitions. Simply labeling someone a terrorist group often has strong financial, legal, moral implications. And so I was careful to try to think about many of these groups as not being solely terrorist groups. And frankly, that's not even language we should probably be using. These are actions, not identities. So someone may do terrorist actions, but on another day they may be engaging in a political process, or they may be engaging in more traditional kinds of warfare elements. So I think that was a really important part to think about, that terrorism is often one choice in a whole variety of choices that a political group may use to try to accomplish their goals. So it isn't it isn't necessarily a defining element of an organization, but usually part of a collection of tactics. So Bridget Nakos has this idea of mass-mediated terrorism, and I think it's an important idea because it doesn't lay all of the blame for terrorism at the feet of the media, but it does acknowledge the media's role in kind of a circle or a dialectic with terrorist groups. So she says the centrality of communication via the mass media in what I call the calculus of mass-mediated political violence, or the calculus of mass-mediated terrorism. And what I thought was interesting about this idea is it really gets into organizational decision making. that groups are making choices about what they do with some eye towards what kind of media coverage they're going to get. And I think that implies something different than the standard narrative of terrorism being random violence that is just kind of expressive and they're going out and just want to hurt people. That no, I really do think that there is calculation involved in this, and there is weighing of options and different choices. And that what terrorist groups, and I'm going to continue to use the language as a shorthand, even though it's really probably not valid, what terrorist groups are doing when they're using violence is that they're gaining entry into the political conversation. That for the most part, these are groups who do not have access to the political conversation and using terrorism as a tool to get them into that conversation. So what terrorist groups are looking for from media is they're looking for publicity. They need access for persuasive communication. They often, will use terrorism as an entry point to then have goals or manifestos or other kinds of things enter the political sphere. They're engaging with media much as if they have a public relations strategy. So if you can imagine other kinds of political groups that determine how they want to spread their message and take steps to do that, I think you can imagine terrorist groups doing that as well. Getting coverage in the media also provides status and legitimacy. Someone who is, the media provides a very filtering function that only allows us to see the access to certain numbers of groups. Using terrorism gets these groups into the conversation and gets them on the list. So this is kind of the process as we normally see it, that you have a terrorist group doing an action, there's a media response to that action, which is, do I cover it, do I not cover it, how do I cover it? There's an audience response then to the media coverage, so what you and I all do when we read this, do we look into it further, do we just take the story on face value? And then there's potentially a behavioral policy response in terms of political leaders or political thought leaders within a community. And most people are describing this as kind of, we have an event, the first order effect, the second order effect, and a third order effect, and it's very linear, and this is how we go. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I think that there's a set of decisions. The terrorist group makes a decision on what they're going to do, and that's based on their capacity, it's based on their ideology, it's based on their goals and how they see what they're doing meeting their goals. And then what they could do may vary. They may commit an attack, they may issue statements, they may do some kind of political engagement, but that they're making a decision about how they want to get where they want to go, based on a variety of factors. In the media response, they're making a decision about what to cover and how to cover it based on newsworthiness, dominant norms in social discourses. What connection to other events does this event have? Does it tap into political conversations that are important? And then they'll make a decision on both the quantity and quality of the coverage they're going to give. For the audience, the same thing. We're absorbing the media along with our knowledge, our values and beliefs, and our past opinions. And that's turning into whether we pay attention to this issue. What is our opinion? Are we forming a new opinion? Are we changing an opinion? So we have some different ways that we can go. And then in the behavioral policy response, the impact, that third order impact, is going to be based on what's previous policy. What's the capacity of this policy organization? What is their political opinion? And so they could change or confirm policy. They could make statements. They could do other kinds of things. So it's a much more complicated in what the inputs are. But then I also think there's an important set of inputs that are coming back in the process. So terrorist group is also looking at what happened in terms of media response the last time I did something. So if I bombed a market last time and the media coverage seemed to indicate that I really got the kind of coverage I want, maybe bombing a market again is a good way to go. We saw this particularly around female suicide bombers, and there's some particular moments around this, but the first female suicide bomber in Israel-Palestine was not claimed by any organization for several days after she did that, which was not within the pattern of most of the suicide bombings. And it appeared, there were some stories going around that potentially she had been accidentally a suicide bomber, that she had been carrying these materials for her brother who was actually going to be the suicide bomber. But the media coverage came out very strongly interested in finding out why she did this. And there was a lot of furor over, wow, this conflict's gotten so bad, the Palestinians have it so bad that even the women are blowing themselves up. And it really changed some of the tenor of the conversation. And within about 3 days, that action was claimed and then loudly proclaimed, and there was graffiti written on all the walls where the different an organization had claimed her. So it really does appear that there is some feedback loop. into what the groups are doing based on previous action. And that's really the loop that I'm trying to get into, is to see what groups might be doing with an eye towards their media coverage and how they might potentially be learning from past actions. So there's a couple different ways that we can think about media coverage. One is quantity and one is quality. Most of the research, particularly around terrorism, has focused on quantity. How many articles does a group receive? How many media outlets pick up a story? How many times is this organization's name mentioned? And what this really comes down to is the gatekeeping function of the news media. But there's a series of criteria that terrorism is perfect for. It meets very, very well. It guide the media into thinking, is this newsworthy? Is this something that's going to sell newspapers? Is this something that's going to get readers of my TV show, watchers of my TV show? What's the impact going to be? So the news media plays a really important gatekeeping function. And even though we now have this kind of expansion of social media, and so there's lots of other voices that can be heard, a lot of that social media still goes back and references mainstream media, and references the different videos, pictures, other kinds of things that are coming from mainstream media. So that gatekeeping function still is really important. But then once they've decided to cover the story, there's a couple different ways they can do this. So what I was really interested in was thinking about the quality of the coverage. How does media coverage change based on different elements of an event? And I found a couple different people who had tried to do some research and tried to create some categories to help us evaluate the qualitative differences. But none of them really quite, I think, took on some making statements about qualitative coverage in the way I wanted to. But I wanted to try to build on what they were doing a little bit and see if we could make it a little more complicated. So one researcher, Karen Cerullo, found that there's a pattern in how journalists construct stories, and that pattern seems to indicate moral messages. So they are implying to us, by how they construct the story just semantically, what message we should be taking away from that. And she found a lot of consistency in how those were covered. So she identified a couple of sequences. Victim sequences are when the very first thing you hear about in the article is about the victim. And what this implies is you're entering the story through their eyes. And what she found was that abnormal violence, deviant violence, was very, very strongly correlated to stories that were written in victim sequences. So when you read a story that started with the victims, you were being sent the message that this was deviant violence, and that was something that journalists were unconsciously doing. She also found a performer sequence, and this is when you enter the story through the eyes of the perpetrator of the violence. And she found this very closely correlated with legitimate violence. So she had found that this often was the format for police-involved shootings, for sports violence, for other kinds of ways in which societies legitimize violence. So she felt like performer sequences were implying to us that this violence is legitimate. And then there's also contextual or double casting sequences, which imply much more ambiguity about the violence. So she found these for controllable disasters, things like that, where we really start to get a lot of the context. Suicides, euthanasia, were usually presented in either contextual or double casting sequences. So this is kind of what her research showed, is how consistent these different sequences were for the different categories of violence, whether it was deviant, normal, or ambiguous violence. What's probably the most interesting on this chart is that terrorism is one of the few cases where it's really split among a variety of different sequences. There seems to be ambiguity in the moral messages that are being conveyed about terrorism. So this is from Iyengar, who does a lot on framing of media, and he identified that there's two frames that you can be presented information in. One is an episodic frame, in which you're really only talking about that particular incident, and the entire article is focused just on that incident. The other is the thematic frame. And a thematic frame usually seats this incident in a much wider context and with much more information. When thinking about terrorist groups, I think one of the things that would be very favorable for them is if they can get information about them presented in a thematic frame. If they can get this grounded in the history or the context of the conflict, if they can get information about the group's grievances presented. When it's focused in a very episodic frame, we tend to be focused more on the victims, more on the destruction, other kinds of things, and less on the reasons why this happened. So I think from my perspective, I think the thematic frame would serve their communication interests. And then from some work I've done previously, there were some differences in what kind of motivation themes are presented. Are you presented with themes about what, are you presented with information about why the individual did this? Are you presented with information about why the group did this? Are you presented with information about society at large and what its impact was on making this happen? And it really, individual themes allow us as the reader to connect with why someone's doing something. We can see, we can develop sympathy for them or empathy, at least see where they're coming from. So for the research that I'll show you later, when individual themes were present, that seemed to me to be favorable to the terrorist organization. It was allowing a connection, a human face, allowing information about trauma and other kinds of things that had been suffered to surface. And then there was content frames, and these, a variety of different researchers found that these were common frames in media coverage of all kinds. An attribution of responsibility frame, which essentially throws responsibility for the event on the government, that they haven't done what they were supposed to do. A human interest frame, which places the human face on it. A conflict frame, which sets us up as being competing parties. A morality frame, in which the news seems to be implying there's a moral message for all of us. And an economic frame, which focuses on the economic consequences of an event. And what I was particularly interested in was the attribution of responsibility frame and the extent to which a news account was framing something that was happening related to terrorism as the responsibility of the government to fix, putting pressure on the government, potentially pressure on the government for overreaction. So we took a look at the content frames also. So this is 4 different ways that I found in the literature in which you could make qualitative distinctions between media coverage, that you could actually go in and evaluate or try to code different media coverage in different categories. So the question is, do terrorist groups manipulate or influence the media coverage that they get? And I think our common sense answer to that is yes, they do. It seems like they do. It seems like they would try to. But how? What is it they're doing that could potentially manipulate the coverage that they're getting? And that was really one of the main questions. So if they're making decisions about what they do in order to manipulate media coverage, then they're making decisions about what to do, where to do it, when to do it, who to do it with, and who to do it to. And I think those are all ways in which they might potentially be trying to manipulate media coverage. So what I wanted to find out was that, I have this common sense idea, I think we all do, that there is some manipulation happening. Does it? Are there elements of what a terrorist group does that can change the kind of coverage they get, not just the amount? And then the second question is the media coverage of a terrorist group changing when a group is in an escalatory phase or a de-escalatory phase? Can we tie the story of a conflict to the kind of media coverage that they're getting? And so what I did is I focused on 2 particular conflicts where terrorism is currently or was being used, particularly conflicts that had both escalatory and de-escalatory patterns, so Northern Ireland, Israel-Palestine. And I looked at written newspaper articles from 4 different newspapers, the Times of London, New York Times, the Irish Times, and Jerusalem Post, and developed a sample and a coding strategy to try to get in a fairly large and a large number of articles, be able to evaluate some of these potential differences. The first sample I used was about terrorism in general, and so I randomized months from the beginning and end of 2 decades, and then took from the beginning of the 2010s, took a month. And I just did a LexisNexis search for the word terrorism to see what came up. And there, quite a few articles came up to search for the word terrorism. So I developed a sampling strategy from within those articles to randomize which ones we took. For the second sample, again, I did a LexisNexis search, but what I did is I took a history of the Israeli-Palestine conflict and the Northern Ireland conflict and looked for 6 significant events. Do I have that on the next one? Dope. Looked for 6 significant events in the conflict, 4 that were destructive and potentially 2 that were more constructive to the peace process. And I took a month before and a month after that event and searched for the word either IRA or Hamas. to focus in on get articles that were particularly relevant to them. And then again, had to do some random sampling within those populations. And then we came up with a coding strategy, and I thought I would share this just so you have an idea of what the poor coders had to go through. And essentially what we did was set up a series of independent variables. We wanted to know what was the triggering event for this news story, what prompted it, because they weren't all terrorist attacks. Some of them were press releases, some of them were government actions, the death or the jailing of a terrorist, other kinds of things. So what event triggered this news story? I asked them to code the conflict the story was related to, what terrorist group was involved if they knew. For violent events, what kind of violence was it? What was the location? How many victims were hurt or killed? What was the identity of the victims? Were they civilians? Were they government officials? Who were they? And then I asked for them to decode if the victims shared the same identity group as the perpetrators, or if they were different, and if they knew the gender of the perpetrator. So then these differences that I talked about in terms of how coverage can qualitatively vary became the dependent variables. So what sequence was this article presented in? What frame? Was it episodic or thematic? Did they have these thematic explanations? And what did they have the content frames? Which content frame was each article in? And then I had 3 coders get to work on this pile of 350, 400 articles. And one of the things that I think was a challenge, and was definitely a challenge we tried to address, was how to make sure all these coders were coding these things the same way. So we set up an initial pool of articles that they coded and I coded. We got together a couple different times to talk about the interpretation of the coding instructions and how that worked. And I think we were relatively successful at having the intercoder reliability that we needed. But that was definitely a challenge, because thinking about a lot of these framing questions, it's very interpretive. How do you interpret whether it's a thematic or episodic frame? So I had wonderful undergrad coders who did a great job. So I subjected my committee to an acre of tables and figures, and I will not do that to you. But just to have a couple highlights. I think one of the things that we found when I actually started going in to do the data analysis was that I needed to do a lot of combination of variables in order to be able to get effect sizes and significance. So running the data based on what kind of a triggering event it worked using all 9 different kinds didn't work. But if I combined those in some different ways, it did. So one of the ways to combine them was this an active event or a passive event? So a passive event being the release of a news story or release of a press statement, the anniversary of an important event, which often got a lot of coverage. Passive events obviously were something somebody was doing. So a terrorist attack, an attack by the government, other kinds of things. And I was looking for whether or not that had an effect on our particular dependent variables. And there were some places where it was significant. So a passive event, an active event was more likely to have a victim or a terrorist sequence than a passive event, which makes sense, I think, in that focus. So the other way to combine these was to look at who had initiated the event. Was it initiated by the terrorist group, by the government, by some kind of outside contextual, outside context? And unsurprisingly, when terrorists initiated the event, the sequences in which they were framed first, so the ones in which this was being presented as normal violence, increased. So by actually initiating something, they were taking control of the media coverage and getting them covered as if this was legitimate violence, or at least ambiguous violence. When terrorists initiated actions, they actually got less thematic coverage. So they actually got less backstory when they did something than if the government had done something or outside events initiated this. And then we saw some differences, significant differences in the themes as well. Violence also, when it was a violent action as opposed to non-violent, it also increased the victim and terrorist sequences. Again, I think that kind of logically makes sense that that's what would happen. But violence decreased the amount of thematic frames, and it really didn't have much effect on the theme. So it was kind of interesting that violence didn't seem to make as much of a difference in this as I thought it would. And then casualties, the number of casualties. As casualties rise, the terrorist sequences, the ones that are legitimizing this violence with that moral message, actually decreased. And we found that kind of across the board that a violent action, whether it was violent or not, didn't seem to matter, but increasing number of casualties seemed to create less favorable coverage for the terrorist group. So if they were violent with no casualties, that seemed to be kind of the best epicenter. And then this is some of the other frames. And again, there weren't necessarily significant, weren't a lot of significant results on this part. So this is just a sample. This is if the trigger event, who the trigger event is initiated by. This is if the terrorist group does it, the government initiates it, or the context. The blue is the victim-civilian sequence, which would make this really send some moral message that this is deviant violence. The green is the government sequence, which would indicate that it kind of legitimizes the government. The brown is the terrorist group sequence, which is legitimizing the terrorist group as the actor. And then the purple is contextual. So when the government initiated actions, the government had the highest sequence. When terrorist groups did it, they had the highest sequence. So there were some differences. Now, by the time we'd gone through all the sampling, though, a lot of these effect sizes were pretty small. So there would be a significance, or it would be a significant result, but the actual effect size wasn't necessarily always that large. So, having discovered that I had complicated my life way more than I needed to with a whole million variables that were causing me trouble in terms of getting effect sizes and other kinds of things, we created a variable that was called favorable coverage. So what I looked at was if this was in a terrorist sequence, so it was legitimizing violence, or it was a thematic frame, so we're getting contextual information about this particular event, or we were talking, or it had themes of individual motivation, which would allow the reader to connect more and humanize this event, considered it favorable coverage. And so of the sample, the general sample of 149, 60.4% of those articles were considered favorable coverage. And then went back and tried to look at some of these other variables. Found that favorable coverage was most likely when the context, not terrorists or the government, actually initiated the action. So it was more likely to either be in a victim's or a terrorist sequence, have these contextual information presented, or have individual motives presented. Of the 47 articles about something terrorist groups initiated, favorable coverage was actually more likely in the absence of violence. So just to clarify, favorable coverage doesn't actually mean that this was pro-terrorist group. It means that the information being presented, I think, serves the terrorist group's communication goals. It serves their goals of connecting with individuals, having context be known about, and getting some of their grievances out into the public. So it was actually more likely in the absence of violence. For the articles about violence, it was more likely to be favorable when there was no casualties. So 85.7% of the articles about violence were favorable with no casualties. Only 43% were favorable when there were casualties. So there's an odd kind of disincentive here, right? We know from a lot of the quantity literature that if you're violent, you're more likely to get covered. But this is saying that you're likely to get the kind of coverage you want if you can do this without casualties. So it was an interesting, that was interesting. So this is actually just the chart with or without casualties. The blue is unfavorable, the green is favorable. So quite a difference from when they're absent on the left and present on the right. So the second sample, I looked at the samples as a whole, and they shared in general most of the characteristics of the larger sample that was about terrorism in general. But for each conflict, there were 6 events. 4 were counterproductive to a peace process. 2 were productive, ambiguous or productive for it. And like I said, I took the month before and the month after the articles. And so this is a whole bunch of stuff. But I think the interesting thing that is on here is how little variation there actually was before and after any particular event. And that's for all of them. So whether they were positive or not, the percentage of coverage that was favorable really didn't change very much, which really indicates to me that I think there's much more ingrained journalistic cultures going on at these different time periods, and that one particular event isn't really shifting in general how journalists are covering this particular organization. In other words, I don't think the manipulation that we're foreseeing happening isn't really happening on an event-by-event basis, or at least not to a substantial event. What was interesting about it, though, was, so this is over the life of a conflict from the IRA, from the first event was in 1992, the last event was in 2002. At the very beginning, we see that 70% of the coverage of the IRA, roughly, both before and after this particular bombing, was favorable. When you get down to here, 1996, when they were in a ceasefire, only 54.5% of that coverage was favorable. So there are some trends over the decade, even if there isn't as much variation within the event. This was for the Hamas case, and again, we've got 2 bombings. This is when a leader was killed, a bombing, a ceasefire, and then the breaking the ceasefire. And again, there's really not much difference before and after an event in the amount of coverage that's favorable. So they really aren't having that kind of moment-to-moment impact. And when they do, it's not always the way that we would expect. It may be that, for instance, before this bombing, or this probably is what we expect, before this bombing was 68.8% favorable, and after was only 55% favorable. So doing this bombing decreased the amount of favorable coverage, but it wasn't as big an effect as was expected. So I started thinking about how to combine both the quantity and quality findings to see if there was some leverage for thinking about how terrorist groups might be manipulating media coverage. And actually what I found was pretty interesting. The column here is the percentage change in the number of articles that got pulled before and after the event. So for this bombing in Northern Ireland at the beginning, there were 16 articles before the event. After the event, there was 25% more. So they increased the articles covering them by 25% with that in the time frame of that bombing. They were 69.2% favorable before that event. That increased 1.4% after the bombing. So trying to think about how could we combine some of this quantity and quality literature. The one that I thought was most interesting is that when they signed the ceasefire, it increased the number of articles substantially that were written about the IRA, but it only increased a little bit their favorable coverage. I was thinking about, well, that's a socially positive thing for them to do, is to enter this ceasefire. But when you go and look at this next column down, so this is right before they break the ceasefire 2 years later, they're only at this point before the event getting half the coverage, and they're getting coverage that is almost 20% less favorable than when they entered the ceasefire. So this period of peace process, I think what this indicates to me is this period of being in the peace process and participating in the political process actually decreased their control over the media coverage. Because they weren't being violent, because they weren't engaging, they didn't have the splashy things in the media, they weren't being covered as much, and their coverage wasn't as favorable. Their grievances weren't continuing to be put out into the public sphere and the public discourse. And I thought that this was interesting as a disincentive for them to continue to participate in the peace process. If they've lost control of their media message, the way for them to get control of that media message back is to break the ceasefire and do something violent. So I think it was interesting to think about how the quantity and quality could be going together to disincentivize the behavior that we would like them to do in this peace process. And then there wasn't as much difference with the Hamas case. There wasn't as much trending over time. So this goes from 1994 to 2008. There was relative consistency in how much favorable coverage the groups got. There were some spikes, particularly around suicide bombings and when a leader was killed. Some spikes in the amount of coverage, but there wasn't as some of the same broad gaps. So it was interesting to see a lot of change in the IRA case and a lot of change in just the culture of how they were being presented by the media over time. But then for the Hamas case, there was relative consistency over a longer period of time, over 14 years. So what does it mean? Terrorist groups have the most positive impact on their coverage by initiating events that receive coverage. So they're more likely to get covered in a terrorist sequence that legitimizes their violence. They're more likely to get contextual information presented. When they can make the news by doing something nonviolent, they tend to receive more favorable coverage. So they need to get violent. They need to be violent to make the news. But as we saw, if they don't have casualties or if they are nonviolent, the coverage is actually more favorable. So there's an interesting dichotomy, right? And that de-escalatory behavior by terrorist groups is not actually rewarded by more favorable media coverage. So entering a peace process does not actually help someone engage their message. And I think that intuitively that kind of makes sense to us. But it's interesting if we think about incentives and how we're incentivizing political groups. When we looking at the paired cases, I think what was most significant was the lack of change before and after events in terms of the favorability of coverage. So it appears that they may actually be able to manipulate whether or not they do get covered, but not necessarily what kind of coverage they're getting, and is it coverage that's good for them. And that media organizations have fairly resilient patterns for covering these actions, irrespective of what they are, even if they're really dramatic. They're resilient patterns. And the terrorist groups, I think, essentially have less capacity to actually manipulate the type of coverage they receive than I think we all kind of common sense would understand or would guess they do. So they are manipulating the quantity, but don't have much effect on the quality. And I think that's it.